Hello from the Channel studio in London and welcome to another edition of Foreign Dispatches, the programme that takes you around the world in 25 minutes. I'm Teniola Uyitayo. On the programme this week, sanctions and flight disruptions squeeze UN aid stocks in Niger, plus continuous flow of Sudanese refugees into Chad as fighting rages. Over 2 weeks after Niger's democratically elected president, Mohamed Bazoum, was overthrown by his presidential guard, aid agencies are scrambling to make contingency plans as sanctions threaten to increase the number of people in need. Over 4 million people were already targeted for UN emergency assistance in the West African country before the July 26 power grab led to border and airspace closures, squeezing vital humanitarian supplies.
Niger's coup is hitting shoppers hard as prices for basic goods are soaring. Ibu Kane, for one, is feeling it. He says the price for a sack of rice has gone up by more than a third to around the equivalent of $25. The cost of cooking oil is also up.
Frankly, I'm feeling it in my pocket, and right now, where we are, we're all stocking up. I think most householders are stocking up at home. Already, just a few days of this and prices are up. In a month's time, what's it going to be like? That is the question.
The toppling of President Mohamed Bazoum last month prompted ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, to close border and sever commercial ties with Niger. It's already one of the world's poorest nations, and some groups are urging the bloc to reconsider the move to avoid making hardship worse for Nigerians. The military junta leader has already floated the possibility of difficult weeks and months ahead. While panic buying doesn't seem to have kicked in, many are feeling the pinch. Still, the situation hasn't fueled much criticism of the coup. Here, thousands of supporters of the military junta flocked to a stadium in the capital Niamey, undaunted by the threat of military intervention by ECOWAS, as its ultimatum for coup leaders to reinstate the president expired on Sunday. Nigerians were also seen on the streets celebrating after the country closed its airspace, and delegations from neighbouring Mali and Burkina Faso visited the country in support. Both countries are also currently ruled by military leaders. ECOWAS met on Thursday, August the 10th, to discuss its standoff with the junta and the bloc's next move. Even before the coup, more than 3 million of Niger's 26 million population were facing acute food shortages. Exacerbating the squeeze, some Western nations, including the United States, have also cut aid to Niger. In a country where foreign assistance makes up 40% of its budget, aid agencies are scrambling to make contingency plans.
So more than the 4.3 million people we had planned on supporting through emergency humanitarian assistance, we might see that number growing and growing fast. The risk is that we start running out of assistance materials to be able to help out people. I'm talking about simple things that are so life-saving. I'm talking about vaccines. I'm talking about food. But I'm also talking about cash. This is one way for us to be able to empower people to be able to access what they really need. But without cash flows in the country, some people will soon be feeling the pinch of this.
Meanwhile, there have been suggestions the coup leaders have asked for help from Russia's Wagner mercenary group, which is known to be present in neighbouring Mali. The seventh power grab in West and Central Africa in 3 years has attracted global attention, partly due to Niger's pivotal role in a war with militants and its uranium and oil reserves. The country is of economic and strategic importance for the United States, Europe, China and Russia.
We've also been following the situation in Sudan and Chad, countries who have also experienced military takeovers in recent years. Hundreds of thousands of people have fled to Chad since conflict started in April between Sudan's army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. The fighting erupted amid disputes over an internationally backed plan for a transition to civilian rule.
As the conflict in Sudan continues to force people out of the country, Chadian horse-drawn cart owners are transporting Sudanese refugees and their belongings across the border and into Chad.
When we were forced out because of the war, we came here with nothing. But my brother is going to help me anyway and take me to the camp. I thank him for that, because I don't have any money, and he still offered me a ride.
Whether the refugees have money or none at all, cart owners say they still help them make the journey.
These Sudanese do not have money and their conditions are rough. If they have some money, we help them. And even if they do not have any, we will still help them.
Some taxis also operate by the border, doing several trips a day. Fighting between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces began in April this year. Since then, more than 4 million people are believed to have been displaced. The highest number, more than 377,000, have fled to Chad from the western Sudanese region of Darfur, where witnesses have blamed Arab militias aligned with the RSF for a wave of ethnically targeted attacks against non-Arab groups.
We are witnessing a worrying situation here in Chad. Around 348,000 Sudanese refugees crossed from Sudan to the eastern part of Chad, which we are supporting for now. That adds on top of 600,000 of refugees already existing in the country, being from Sudan all time or from other nationalities. The situation is deteriorating in terms of food security, in terms of the economic deterioration, and also from malnutrition perspective. The impact of the local and the global conflicts also has its footprints when it comes to the challenges that we are facing here to support those people.
For those who remain in the country, the situation is grim. The conflict has turned Khartoum and other urban areas into battlefields. More than two-thirds of hospitals remain out of service amid increasing reports of attacks on health facilities.
The situation inside Sudan, where UNHCR teams are present, is untenable, as the needs far outweigh what is humanly possible to deliver with the available resources. In White Nile State, a lack of essential medicines, staff and supplies is severely hampering health and nutrition services in all 10 refugee camps, where over 144,000 newly displaced refugees from Khartoum have arrived since the conflict started. As many families have been on the move for weeks with very little food and medicine, rising malnutrition rates, disease outbreaks, and related deaths continue to be observed. In addition, severe cholera and malaria are expected in the coming months due to flooding from the continuing rains and inadequate sanitation facilities.
UN officials say 24 million people are in need of humanitarian support, 14 million of them children.
Children have consistently borne the brunt of recurring violence, upheaval, and displacement, and this is the case again. But I also want to say there's no exaggeration that the situation that they're facing today is unprecedented. However difficult things have been in the past, it's never been this difficult. 435 children have been killed in the conflict, at least 2,025 children injured. That's an average of one child killed or injured every hour since the war began. And we know that that's an underestimate. The true toll is much, much higher.
93 humanitarian partners reached at least 2.5 million people with some sort of life-saving assistance across Sudan between April and June. Let's not forget the target is 24 million people. 24 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance, of which the target is 18 million. 24 million people is half the population of a country that before 15th of April was doing not too bad. There were needs, but we were not targeting people in the capital.
Rights group Amnesty International has also accused warring parties of committing extensive war crimes in the ongoing conflict, including deliberate killings of civilians and sexual assaults.
Many civilians have been caught in the crossfire as both the SAF and the RSF, often using explosive weapons with wide area effects, have launched frequent attacks from and in densely populated civilian neighborhoods. We have been told and we were able to document that scores of women and girls, some as young as 12, have been subjected to sexual violence, including rape by members of the warring sides, mostly by the RSF and Arab militia.
The conflict in Sudan is not getting even nearly the kind of attention that the conflict in Ukraine has. The humanitarian response has not been to the same level as well, and nor has been the willingness of countries to receive Sudanese who need to flee.
The East African country plunged into chaos in mid-April when months-long tensions between the military and paramilitary group, the Rapid Support Forces, exploded into open fighting in the capital of Khartoum and elsewhere in the country. There's been a number of international efforts to mediate and prevent a prolonged civil war, but none has been successful so far.
To the situation in Ukraine now, the Ukrainian government claims more than 19,000 children have been illegally taken to Russia since the start of the war. Russia acknowledges it has transferred children from Ukraine, but argues it's saving them from the horrors of war. After nearly a year under Russian occupation, 16-year-old orphan Ilona narrates her daring escape.
16-year-old Ilona Paviluk describes the moment she returned home to Ukraine. She spent nearly a year and a half locked away, hiding under Russian occupation. The Russians came to their village near the Dnipro River at the start of the invasion last year. She says she couldn't leave the house, not even to the park just outside their home.
I wasn't studying. I haven't finished school. I don't have any documents, so I'm considered a dummy, I guess. I couldn't go anywhere because my father was worried. He said that the Russians could hurt me.
Her father died of AIDS last month, leaving her and her younger brother orphans and making them part of a particularly vulnerable group amid the war. Orphans are the most urgent cases for groups like Save Ukraine, a charity that maintains an underground network inside occupied parts of Ukraine and Russia itself.
It is much harder to bring back an orphan child. The Russians assign a legal guardian to them to replace the previous guardian they had on Ukrainian territory. They assign a guardian or place the child into an adoptive family. After that, no possible agreements can work, and it is very hard to get the child back.
President Vladimir Putin claims to have annexed Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine. As a result, Moscow said it has gathered hundreds of thousands of orphans and vulnerable children there, taking them back to Russia. Ukraine says the practice amounts to forced deportation to erase their Ukrainian identity. That's a crime against humanity, something President Putin has already been indicted for by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Ilona and her brother were able to escape with the help of charity Save Ukraine. But the journey wasn't simple. They traveled through Russian-held territory to Russia itself, then to Belarus, until they finally made it back into Ukraine. Details of the journey are kept confidential to protect activists along the route. The pair are living at the group's hostel in Kiev until they can sort their paperwork. Then they'll be off to relatives living in Slovakia as a refugee.
When Foreign Dispatches returns in just a moment, 3 years after the Beirut port explosion, families of victims are still seeking justice. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying with us. The annual commemoration of the Beirut port blast that killed over 220 people has now become a symbol of something else, an outpouring of anger over the lack of action in identifying those responsible. Though the memory of the blast remains vivid, the pursuit of justice seems to have been forgotten, with no one brought to book.
For nearly 3 years now, 10 portraits on the outer wall of a Beirut fire station have honored its firefighters killed in the explosion at the city's port. They're among the more than 220 people who died in one of the largest ever non-nuclear explosions 3 years ago. The 10 fire brigade members headed out to an initial fire call on August the 4th, 2020, but never returned.
As a fire brigade, we extract corpses. We see ugly things other people can't bear. But the port blast was something else.
The blast was caused by hundreds of tons of ammonium nitrate unloaded at the port years earlier. It took weeks to find and bury all the rescuers. Since then, challenges have kept piling up. 4 years of financial collapse left firefighters countrywide without enough spare parts for trucks, fireproof clothing, and other equipment. Some ended up switching jobs as the value of their salaries collapsed with the local currency. A few streets away in the Maramakiel district, one of those hit hardest by the blast, renovated restaurants and bars host an influx of foreign tourists and Lebanese expatriates. But those attending a memorial say they can't forget. Rita Hidi lost her son, her brother-in-law, and her nephew. For her, moving on is not an option.
As parents, we're still in August 4. This time has not passed for us. We are getting stronger each year to achieve justice and hold to account those who did this to our sons. Our sons were wronged, and no one accepts injustice.
Since the days following the explosion, the probe into the blast has faced a slew of political and legal challenges, and no senior figures have been held to account. The lack of progress in the investigation stands in stark contrast to the pledges made by national leaders and the international community.
6 months on from the worst modern-day natural disaster to strike Syria, Joma Biazid, who lost his wife and 2 other children in the February earthquake, says his son is all he has left. Other families in northern Syria are still living in tents. The deadliest earthquake in the region in decades killed approximately 58,000 people.
This video shows the emotional reunion of a father and his toddler following the devastating quake that hit Syria in February. Joma Biazid lost his wife and 2 of his children. He himself was under the rubble for 4 days. Now, 6 months on, he says he cannot imagine life without his son, the only other surviving member of his family.
My boy is all I have left. He is the only thing that has made me able to continue living. If, God forbid, Ibrahim had died too, I would have definitely died shortly after him. But thank God Ibrahim is alive.
Father and son lived together in an apartment in the town of Aldana near the Turkish border. Many buildings were destroyed here.
I am not happy. I would be lying to myself if I said I was happy. I am not happy because it is difficult to overcome what I have lost. And even if I was able to buy a car again, it would not be enough to compensate for what I lost. Also, it is impossible to forget my wife and children.
Elsewhere in Jandaris, one of the hardest hit areas, Ahmad Musa Ahmad is still terrified of living in a building. Instead, he lives in a tent at his farm with his 9 children.
It is necessary to have a house, because next month, if it rains, I would not know where to go. I do not think I could go back to the village. I cannot afford to live with my children in a building because I'm scared of other quakes. The boy I lost, I can never forget what happened.
The February earthquakes were the worst modern-day natural disasters to strike Syria and Turkey, killing upwards of 54,000 people across the two countries. The UN says many more thousands were displaced by the quakes. Meanwhile, Syria has extended permission for the United Nations to deliver aid via 2 Turkish border crossings for 3 months.
We greatly welcome the extension of permission by the government of Syria through a letter we received to the Emergency Relief Coordinator on the 6th of August, which will allow us to utilize the Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai border crossings until the 13th of November. So we have received that letter from them. Meanwhile, the government of Syria has responded to a letter from Undersecretary General Martin Griffith concerning Bab al-Hawa. We stand ready to resume aid operations through the Bab al-Hawa crossing as soon as possible. The UN and our humanitarian partners will also continue to deliver the urgently needed aid, as I mentioned, through the Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai border crossings.
After more than 12 years of conflict, the United Nations says more than 15 million people need aid across the country, a record number, and it's struggling to fund support for Syrians and other crises worldwide.
And finally, more than 130,000 Palestinian children in Gaza have joined summer camps run by the United Nations to give them a break from the stresses of living in a strip of land that is under an economic blockade and often embroiled in conflict with Israel.
Letting kids be kids, these Palestine children are participating in a series of activities, including greening, recycling, sports, drawing, handcrafts, and language learning. It's part of a summer camp organized by the United Nations.
So really the most important thing is 130,000 children get the opportunity just to be kids. Despite the economic situation, despite the ongoing conflict, they can come to summer fun weeks with UNRWA and just be children.
According to the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, a recent agency study found that 38% of children in Gaza showed symptoms of functional impairment affecting their daily lives. UNRWA runs 284 schools in Gaza, serving at least 290,000 students.
We do it for 2 main reasons. Firstly, we all know that the economic blockade of Gaza is placing an enormous burden on the economy and the individual families. The levels of poverty is rising. So Summer Fun Weeks is designed that every family can send their child to a Summer Fun Week regardless of their income. But most importantly, it's about addressing the psychological impact of the ongoing conflict here in Gaza.
Palestinians have lived through several wars with Israel since 2008, including 5 days of fighting in May. Experts put the number of children needing mental health help at nearly a quarter of the enclave's 2.3 million population that lives under a crippling blockade enforced by Israel and Egypt, which both control and restrict the Gaza Strip's borders.
I came here to entertain myself away from the things I have been subject to, such as wars and conflicts that I witnessed. I may not be like other children around the world, but I'm trying to stay positive no matter what happens.
The activity creates around 3,000 short-term jobs for Gaza youth. Established in 1949 following the First Arab-Israeli War, UNRWA provides public services, including schools, primary health care, and humanitarian aid in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon.
And that's the program today, but remember, our top stories are never far away. You can catch them on channelcv.com. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Teniola Oyetayo. Bye for now.